Now it is. There we go. All right. Welcome everyone to the Fit Pro Show. This is number 2 of our new series. So if you recall, the last series we did the first half of the year was all about building a proper exercise routine. So we went through strength and cardio and warm up and cool down and progression. And now we're tapping into different regions of the body. So the last one we did last month was all on the anterior lower body. So we touched on the quads and all of the anterior muscles that attach to that pelvis and cause a lot of flexion at the hip. We did a lot of squats and lunges. So if you recall that, I did post the replay in our team page. So you feel free to go back and go over all that squatting form and lunge form because it's all super important, probably one of the most important movements we can do. However, today we're going into the posterior lower body. So everything on the back half down there when we're training the hamstrings, the glutes, and going through that hinge movement especially, which is again another really important movement pattern, just like the squat. So pay close attention today. We'll be talking about different anatomy of that region and common pain and injuries, and then going through some exercise tips and variations for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Great way to start it off there. And yeah, since that we were talking about the front chain and all that flexion, we're going to make sure that we get into that hip extension and make sure that we're even from front to back. And like we talk about so much on this show, we're in that flexion, whether it be in the spine or through the hips. So making sure that we counterbalance that is super important. And with this series, we're going to talk about, the exercises, the technique a lot more than we could go in depth on that last series. So I'm excited to get into it. Let's go ahead. You want to first talk about the main muscles that we use? Okay, in that
Definitely.
posterior chain.
Yeah. So touching on those main muscles, we're really going to think about primarily the glutes. So our glutes are made up of the gluteus maximus, the gluteus medius, and then also the gluteus minimus. So, but when we always talk about it, we're like the glutes or the butt. So you don't have to worry about all three of those. Just know that it's a huge muscle and it's made up of those three. And it's kind of in the name. So the maximus is the biggest one on the outside. Medius is kind of in the middle, and then the minimus is that smaller one, and they all attach to the pelvis in a little bit different regions, but they're all equally as important, and they all help perform in that extension and abduction of the hip and legs. So that's going to be when we're moving our leg away from our body or extending that leg back. That's what those muscles are all working together to do.
Exactly. Yeah, and the glute maximus is the biggest, strongest muscle in the entire body. It's followed closely by like the quadriceps and like the lats, some of those big back muscles. But it has so much potential for strength there. We use those in the squats, even on these big posterior chain exercises. We're going to use them a lot here. So really focusing on the glutes.
Yeah, and our glutes should always be activated. A lot of times that's what we work with clients. It's just figuring out how to actually turn them on and keep them on. We notice that when we stand up from a squat or stand up to anything, it's really easy to squeeze your butt cheeks together and get those glutes activated. But can you actually activate them as you're squatting and moving through different movements? It's a challenging thing, and it's a lot of mind muscle connection. But like we touched on the last episode, once you can get those glutes to activate while you're doing movements, a lot of times a lot of pressure and weight can be relieved from the knee joint if you're having any of that knee pain. It also can help with some low back pain that you experience. So again, super important muscle. And then when we're going even, or do you have any more to touch on that, David?
Just a real quick activation point here, but since we're talking about the glutes, go ahead and try to clench those glutes with us right now as you're either seated or standing. Do both at one time. Hopefully everybody can tuck that pelvis under like we talk about and get that squeeze. That next level is try to do one at a time. That is way harder if you're trying to do that right now. You saw me and Hannah, both our eyes kind of go up for a second. Okay. It's like right, left. And then if you're struggling with both of those, a really good place to start out, dial it back a little bit, is flat down on the ground. Do both of those because you get some feedback from the ground. So try to squeeze both cheeks at one time and then see if you can go one at a time. Doesn't take any loading and you get that mind muscle connection.
Yeah, and then sit into a squat and sit down there and see if you can feel, then take it, see if you can squeeze both, and then see if you can do one at a time down there. And that is, if you can get that figured out, you're firing those neurons and that connection is really good.
Next level. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
cool. So then going from the glutes, we go into those hamstrings. So fun fact, hamstrings are made up of three. So we have like the quads, those are four, but hamstrings are three. We have our semitendinosus, our semimembranosus, and the biceps femoris, correct?
Yeah. Yep, that's
Cool.
it. I bet you guys didn't know we have biceps in our legs too.
Yeah,
So
kind of
just like we
random.
curl at the elbow, we can curl at that knee, and you're curling a bicep muscle both ways. So think of that when you're doing like that stretch and squeeze that we talk about on some of these.
Yeah, so those hamstrings is where we notice so much tightness with the hamstrings. Working with a lot of HP employees, just those. I know here in Corvallis, we have our kickball tournament coming up on Friday, and I already know, unfortunately, there's going to be a handful of people with a slight or pulled hamstring. I know some people experience those pulled hamstrings, but it's not fun when they're tight. So that's something that also can affect our pelvis and the tilt, and why we can't squat as low is because that hamstring's causing that butt wing because it's so tight. So I notice a lot of tightness, especially working with clients in those hamstrings.
Yeah, for sure. It's a chronic thing that people deal with. So before you go out for kickball and do that big kick, and especially before you do some type of sprint, just make sure that you loosen up with some mobility and some strength work from some of the exercises that we're going to go over today.
Definitely. And then moving a little bit lower down the body, we're going to go into those calves. And so our calves are actually made up of two muscles. So we have our gastrocnemius and our soleus. And so our soleus is the smaller calf muscle that's underneath the gastrocnemius, and it's a little bit lower on the leg compared to the gastrocnemius is that big, much more meaty part of the calf. They both do end up attaching and kind of forming that Achilles tendon that we majority of us know about. But just a fun fact, we've got two muscles down there, not just the one.
Yeah. So when you think of calves, most people are thinking about just below that knee to like halfway down before you get to that ankle, that meatier portion that Hannah was just talking about. Whenever you do any type of straight leg, ankle flexion, extension, plantar dorsiflexion, then you're going to be hitting that. If you ever do a bent knee version, then you're going to hit by that ankle and soleus. So that's something important. It's not bad to do bent knee version, but if you want what you think of as calves a little bit higher for aesthetic reasons or body composition reasons, you're going to want to do that straight knee version whenever you're moving at the ankle. Just a little note there.
Yeah, and I think you probably see this too, David, but lots of tightness in the calves. I'll have a client try a foam roller for the first time and literally just set their legs on the foam roller, slightly move, not even lift themselves up, and they're like, ow, this hurts. So there's probably a lot of tightness, and we can all work on the mobility of that calf muscle and obviously the ankle joint. But that's a great area to foam roll and really get mobile before you go into any of those lower body moves.
And I think so. Are we hearing a trend here? Glutes a lot of times tight or not active, even more, and then hamstrings really tight, calves really tight. So if you take a lacrosse ball or a foam roller to those, ouch at first, but you can move through it and it's going to get better. Your mobility is going to get better, and you're going to take care of those tissues. Yep.
Yeah, and while we're separating like the front from the back, notice if one's tight or underactive, it flows all the way down, or vice versa. Bottom's tight, underactive, all the way up. And so it just creates this chain of uncomfortableness. And once one gets immobile and not as moving as efficiently as it could, it starts to affect another. And so just really pay attention to that posterior chain, especially. That's where I think I find a lot of issues. Majority of the population have is tight regions there.
Yeah, for sure. Good. Yeah, and that kind of takes us past the muscles that we're talking about, and then into some of the cueing and movement patterns. We want to make sure that we have plenty of time for that stuff. Just a note, we talked about some of the pain like in the knee and things like that on the last episode. Making sure, especially when we're talking about hinging, back pain is something that comes up, and that's something that comes up because your technique is not right, you're not bracing your core properly, or you're going into a bad movement pattern. So just making sure that that nice rod that is our back right there is nice and flat. There's natural curvature there, but making sure that we're bracing that core. What are the things that we talk about? Pulling the belly button in, right? Squeezing those glutes to make sure that everything looks good there. And then that movement pattern, a lot of the cues are exactly the same. You'll see kind of gripping the ground, screwing your feet into the ground, core tight, glutes tight, looking straight ahead is going to be similar. So I say we go ahead and get into some of these. You ready, Hannah?
Yeah, and I do want to touch quickly just on that like back pain that we do experience when it
Yeah, let's
comes
go for it.
to hinging. A lot of people do stray away from those hinging movements because they experience that back pain, but don't let doing the hinging scare you because of that. Just really focus to the form that we're going to be talking through, because it's such an important way to move for forever. So really pay attention. If you're on the line and you struggle with sciatica, that also can be tight, caused by a lot of tight glutes, sitting too much, improper posture. So I know I deal with a lot of employees that have sciatica. So work on that mobility of the glute and foam rolling and getting all of that loose, especially when you're diving into those movements, and then really pay attention to the form during those movement patterns. So now that I got that spiel out, we can go ahead and move forward with the exercises.
Yeah, for sure. And I was going to start with RDL, just which stands for Romanian deadlift, one of the
Don't let it scare
main
you.
hinges. Yeah, exactly. Health lift. We'll call it our health lift here.
Yeah.
And I just start with a dowel, like many things, just unloaded, right? When we start with this. And just like I just said, we're screwing those feet into the ground, hip width apart, all right? Gripping actively. And then you're feeling, as you're gripping actively, I'm feeling all the way from my calves all the way through my quads. Now I'm tucking that pelvis and looking straight forward. You have to make sure you check all those boxes before you get moving, because if you get moving and one of those boxes aren't checked, it's going to be really hard to get back in position. Okay. So right there, when we're thinking about a barbell, I usually say break the bar. Okay. So that means you're really gripping and we're bringing those elbows pointed backwards instead of out to the side like this, pointed backwards. And I'm not going to try to break this out because I might be able to do it. But if you're holding on to a barbell, then that's something that you can think about cueing. Okay. And then from here, we're just pushing those hips back towards the wall as much as possible. Look how this dowel is skimming down my legs. I'm making contact here, and I go down as low as I can without flexing. So for me, that's about right here. If I go farther than that, you'll see what happens, and you'll see that a lot because people want that false range of motion. So make sure that you get to where you can stay nice and firm. Bring those hips forward, and instead of thinking about descending down with that bar, think about those hips moving back and forward right there. I think that's probably the biggest, one of the biggest hurdles. The two things that I see is that back just flexing forward, or people simply thinking about bending over as opposed to pushing those hips back, right? Is that something that you see too, Hannah?
Yeah, I want you to go ahead and show us what someone that was just told to do an RDL would do probably initially before they push their hips back. Like what happens when you don't push your hips back? You bend away, look how far that dowel is away from his legs, and look how he's rounded. Look at that position of his low back and what's happening right there. So that's what happens when you don't push your hips back. Now, David, go ahead and do one that you push those hips back again, and look how drastic that change, that little change is. Push those hips backwards. He keeps those shoulders pulled back, and then there's no round in that low back. His chest is staying up, and he feels a long stretch in the hamstrings. So yeah, that's the biggest cue I always see right there. And another thing that you pointed out to David that the other day talking with me that really made it like click even more, and it helped one of my clients, is to actually already almost put your pelvis into that anterior tilt to push yourself
Yes.
into that hinge. Yeah, that was a big like breakthrough with one of my clients. So thank you.
Perfect.
But yeah, rotate. So we have that neutral pelvis, and then when you rotate it forward, that initiates that backward push with the hips. So that is a great way to think about it as well.
So telling somebody that can light that light bulb, right? When you're thinking about the movement pattern, when we think about going forward and back just through the hips. But if you don't have that connection through your hips yet, and you can't think about pushing those hips back and then following through, one of the simple things that I do with folks, we use the band, remember last time, to push those knees forward to make it knee dominant. You can do the same thing with a loop band and just put it around the hip with somebody, all right? And then take a big step or two forward, and it's already trying to pull me back right there, okay? So for somebody that just wants to reach down, this kind of initiates it without them having to do it, and you can work on that movement pattern, pushing that band back, and you get a little bit of resistance without that axial loading through the spine. So really good option right here if you're just first starting out learning this.
Yeah, and I do want to emphasize that David's legs aren't locked out, but they're also not bending as he goes down.
Right.
He finds that slight bend position and then they don't move. So you have to engage your quads, squeeze right there, and then keep them in that spot. And I know some people,
there's a big
I have had a
difference there.
client, I have had a client lately that's had a hard time like putting 2 and 2 together, but it just takes practice because they can hinge if their legs are locked out, but they can't hinge if their legs have a slight bend in it. So just finding that like steady position and then just slowly working with those hips pushing backwards and then slowly going lower as you start to make that mind muscle connection.
For sure. Yeah. Great point right there. That's something that I have to coach up all the time too, because people think that it's completely locked out, and that's really hard. That's when you'll see the bend in that lumbar a lot quicker than if you just are nice and you have that slight little bend, nice and soft right there, not actively moving there, but just a little cushion right there. Yeah, really good point. So we did the dowel RDL, and then we put that band along with it. Since we have the band right here, another way that we can teach people to hinge like that with this band or with a cable, whatever you have, right, is a cable pull through or a band pull through where you're loaded underneath right here. You take that step forward and it's basically doing the same thing, okay? This one, you really have to tell folks that you need to lock out at that elbow and all the movement is happening through that pelvis, right? Because if you don't, you'll see a lot of this stuff, all right? Or you'll see this like bend and people trying to get really far. So we're locked out, shoulders down and back here, and then that same movement pattern, gripping through the heels, not letting those toes come up because you're back on those heels, still gripping, and then working back and forth right there. Just thought since I had the band out, that's a good one too.
Yeah, definitely. I actually was doing a few of those with the cable before this because I don't do those enough. But it definitely targets those glutes and hams. It felt good.
For sure. Yeah, it really does. So what's that next step when we're talking about the hinge then? If you start with somebody and they're not really loaded up yet, maybe you did some band work, what's the next level for somebody that you're working with then, Hannah?
So probably adding some weight to it with the dumbbells or the barbell.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even
so
a
kettlebell.
You can,
yeah, whatever you have, kettlebell, barbell, dumbbell. I have 2 dumbbells right here. It's really the same thing, everybody. So you're just adding that load and you're not letting that load pull you forward. So with this one, more than when you're unloaded and you're trying to figure this stuff out, you really have to make sure you're braced. And we didn't talk about the shoulder much because we were working our way up, but you need to make sure that you depress and retract those shoulders or you'll see some really funky stuff in that thoracic spine right here. So we're down and back, and then remember, we're tucking that chin straight back, and it's that same movement pattern, okay? Now we are continuing to overload with what we learned, and you just add a little bit of weight right there, working through it.
Yeah, it's that same, you need to pack those shoulder blades and the lats as often as possible during your exercises. So our shoulder blades sit like this when the weight's going to want to pull us forward like that. So we have to take those shoulder blades in the back and rotate them down and then keep them there. Pack those lats, pack those shoulders, keep them there, and remember all of that. So you don't want to be going nice and fast during these moves. You want to be really engaging, making sure everything's activated and pulled to that right posture.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so with the hinges there, that's a great place to start. I probably do RDL variations like that more than any other hinge. But you also can do a good morning where you have the same setup and you have a bar or a dowel on the upper back. You are axial loaded there, and it just makes you really be strong throughout that entire back right here,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because otherwise you're going to be in trouble if you slump forward right there. So one more variation, working that good morning, making sure I probably wouldn't start there for most people unless they're really having a hard time bringing that chest back, and that kind of reemphasizes it. So that might be a good place to start.
Mm-hmm.
But kind of the finish line, if you get there, is deadlifting from the ground with a barbell. Only different, the big difference there is it becomes a little bit more knee dominant, because pretend this is the barbell for a second. Now you're right here, and instead of simply going back and up, now it's kind of simultaneous, where you're moving at that knee, you're moving at that hip together, and you're coming up. You can load it up a lot more. That's why we say this one lasts. But the amount of muscles that you're hitting at one time, the squat and the deadlift, can't beat them.
Yeah, I was gonna say that if we're going into the deadlift, it's almost like the squat, where you're gonna be still hitting the quads, the glutes, the hands, everything.
Yep.
You're not just gonna isolate the back. But yes, the deadlift is kind of the standard deadlift is definitely a combination between a squat and an RDL. So we have to make sure we have that hip hinge, we still have that knee bend. A lot of times I see people where they're too hip hinge, not enough bend, or vice versa. You have to find that happy medium. And I will say some people have longer femurs than others. And so that deadlift position can be really uncomfortable for some people, or really natural for others. But my key takeaway, don't throw the heavy weight on there until you know you're doing it right, because that's where the injuries happen.
Absolutely. That goes with anything that we talk about in here. And there's so many variations of the deadlift, whether you go a little bit more narrow, conventional, or a little bit wider, sumo. You'll feel those adductors a little bit more, that Hannah mentioned before. But the main thing is making sure that all of those cues stay in alignment throughout. Yep.
Yeah, and I really do, if your gym has a hex bar, I know not a lot of our gyms have one of those, but I really do like hex bar deadlifts, just because it really gets that air for injury can't really happen as much, because you're not in that position. You have to keep the shoulders back and push through and get that hip hinge still. So that's a good place to start as well.
Yeah. All right. And then Vincent, good question. In a single leg RDL, which hand should hold the weight?
Yeah. So
what's the answer, Hannah? I know I have one.
You can do it in either.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Oh God, that was nerve-wracking.
Sorry, not to put you on the spot. Yeah, for sure. You can, it's just whether you go ipsilateral, which is that same side, right? Whether you're holding on that same side that you're moving through. If you're right there, then you can do that same one, or you can go contralateral, where it's that opposite arm that has that dumbbell. But as long as you're achieving the same things, now you're adding more to it, because you're getting the strength component, but now you're getting some of that balance, some of that proprioception along the way too, in the single leg work.
Yeah, and I do believe that contralateral is a little bit easier than ipsilateral, because it balances out the weight. So I would maybe start with contralateral, so the weight in the opposite hand of the leg that's planted, and then work your way to the ipsilateral on the same side, and trying to keep those hips facing the floor, because too often we're going to see that hip hinge, and then that's going to happen. So you want to try to keep those hips facing the floor.
Perfect. Yeah, I completely agree. Okay, we got to get through some of these other ones. So let's talk about the hip thrust. You wanna start that with just our bridge?
Yeah, for sure. So going down to the floor, this is going to be our hip bridge. This is a really good exercise, especially if you have underactive glutes, because that's where we're mainly targeting right here. So we always just get all the way down onto the floor. Feet are about hip width apart, in line with the knees, in line with the hips. The closer you have those feet to your glutes, a little bit more quad activation is going to go on. So if you kind of find that 90-degree angle with the knee bend, you're going to get a little bit more hamstring in there. But we just lift up to the sky. When we're doing this again, we want to engage that pelvis. So we don't want to let that pelvis drop into that anterior tilt, so that we have a low back feeling here. We want to almost tuck that pelvis a little bit under before we engage that hip bridge, so we can keep the glutes engaged. We also don't need to go all the way to the sky where you're arching that back. full extension, you can stop right when you feel like you're in a straight line or in that natural engagement of the glutes where you feel that pelvis staying in the same position. Once you lift higher, that pelvis is going to move. You're going to feel that in your low back. So just lowering down and lifting up, trying to keep that all in our glutes the whole time and hamstrings without feeling that in the low back. Core is still engaged right here. And then you can start to work where you grab a dumbbell or a plate and you set it on your thighs or in the crease of your hips. And you can add some weight lifting up and down. You can even then go into some single leg work where we're just doing one leg, lifting up and down, trying not to swing the leg. I see this a lot of times in the gym. Keep those legs nice and in line with the knees, lift up and down. So this is a really great exercise I like to pair with squats because it's going to enforce that glute activation. But if not, I always like to add that also in the warm-up portion so that those glutes are activated as well.
Absolutely. Great activation technique if you're going into some squats or some deadlifts or something like that. Or if you just want some extra booty volume, go for it right there. Lots of good options right there. So she showed just that hip thrust, single leg hip thrust. If you have something that you can elevate to, I have this little box right here. Usually if you're going to use that dumbbell or barbell that Hannah just mentioned, if you have these shoulders up, it makes it a lot easier to set up whatever you're going to use to load it up right here. So all those same cues coming all the way up and then back down. So that's one version. The second version with that box too, you can just bring those feet all the way up. Again, you're extending that range of motion just a little bit, adding some variation so it's not super stale for you. And then we come all the way up, tuck that pelvis back down. And with these, same thing, that upper or that mid and lower back is hitting the floor at the same time. If you feel that low back hitting the floor first, that means you have an arch. You need to make sure that everything's straight through that spine.
Yeah, and I do want to have you do those hip bridges with your back up on it one more time, because what I see a lot is people will drop their glutes and their head will stay back. They won't keep that spine in a straight line. And so they'll keep their head back there, drop, and then they're not having that hinge motion go. So you want to kind of keep everything as like a teeter-totter. It's up, down, all together, not just the back going down and then our head stays up.
Yeah, you
So
see that flex forward like this a lot,
yeah,
right? Where you tuck that chin. Yeah, exactly. Making sure that the cervical is in alignment with everything else. Good point.
Yeah, exactly. So with our last few minutes, feel free to throw any questions in the chat as well. But adding on to a little bit of more accessory movements. So say you've hit a really good posterior leg day or leg day and you want to add a little bit more definition or just toning in some certain areas. We've got leg curls. So if you have a leg curl machine, or there's ways that David's going to show you how to do it with the ball. If you have the machine, that's where you're seated, and it's going to say hamstring leg curls, and that's where you're going to curl in and extend out. I really like to add eccentric movements here as well. And then you can do that with the ball laying down, which I actually had my class do today, which this one's a burner and you might get cramps in your hamstrings. I know I do.
I'm glad you mentioned that. There's some people laughing or rolling their eyes on on the line right now as you say that. But yeah, really good point. What we want to do on this one, same thing. Instead of hip dominant like we did with those RDLs, now we're knee dominant. Now, like we said, we get the big stretch out of those RDLs, which is great. You need that stretch under load to build this portion. But if you want that squeeze and that connection like we talked about through both biceps, we're going to lift those hips all the way up so we have that straight line, and then we're just moving through the knee, bringing it in as much as possible, get that slow eccentric going forward, 1 second, and then 2 or 3 seconds going out like that.
Yeah, that is a great burner with those hamstrings. And then another good accessory move, just working those calves. So it also not only is strengthening the calves, but we're going to work on some ankle mobility. So standing on the ledge of something, letting your heels drop all the way down, going all the way up, lowering down, even doing that on single leg. That's where you're going to really work on getting those calves to be nice and juicy, like some folks on the line work on.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you have a place where you can just raise, I would say the main thing as far as execution for this last one, whether it's 2 leg or single leg, is just to make sure a lot of people bob up and down with every exercise that we do, and we kind of have a loaded spring here in that ankle area. So we want to make sure that you go down as slow as possible, maybe that 3 count again, even get a hold for a second or two so you feel that big stretch, and then you can explode up for 1. So it's 3, 2, 1, nice stretch up, as opposed to you see that dive bomb down and then
Yep.
really coming back up. So yeah, just a good point there.
Definitely. All right. I think that brings us to time. We got a lot of good information thrown at y'all. Feel free to reach out anytime. We are going to start transitioning to our next month, going to some upper body, I believe, right, David? And differentiating like the front and back there as well.
Yep, absolutely. So we're going to get into the core and the upper body for the next 3 episodes now that we got lower body knocked out. Appreciate y'all in the chat box here. Thanks for hopping on live, and yeah, share the recording once we post it and let us know if you have any questions or ideas going forward. Thanks, y'all.
Awesome. Thank you, team.
Yeah, no problem. Take care, everybody.